Hey there, it's Mike Langford. Welcome to another episode of the SoFin Podcast, part of the FinServe Marketing Podcast Network. This week on the show, I want to start things off a little differently than I normally do. I want to start with a question. Did you know that there are only 2,400 companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange? And there are only 3,300 on the NASDAQ. But there are over 1.8 million private companies with 50 or more employees in the United States. That's crazy, right? Less than 1% of the companies in America are publicly traded. Technically, it's way less than 1% because there are a lot more companies with under 50 employees in the United States. Now, on the surface, you might say, meh, okay, who cares? Whatever. So most companies are private companies. That makes sense. It really doesn't impact me. But I would argue that's where you'd be wrong. If you're an active investor, why would you want to limit yourself to accessing only 1% of the total equity market? Think about it. There's a lot of really cool startups that are growing at a breakneck pace that haven't gone public yet, or may never get there because some other giant company may acquire them first. But did you have a chance to have access to their stock? Probably not, right? And there's a lot of other private companies that are out there that are doing great. They just may not have ambitions to go public. Wouldn't you want to have access to those companies? And on the flip side, imagine if you work for or own a stake in one of these 99% of companies that happen to be private. Wouldn't you want to have some access to liquidity for your position? In the event that you want to diversify or take some money off the table? Well, my guests on the show today, Rashad Kurbanov and Hamid Gayibov, the founders of IOWNIT, are on a mission to change the landscape for private securities investments. IOWNIT is an investment platform for private securities that supports listing, investing, and trading. So basically, you can think of it as a new breed of stock market for private securities. It's really innovative. I have a feeling you're also going to enjoy hearing about Hamid and Rashad's entrepreneurial journeys as well. They're very inspiring. But before we jump in, make sure you check out the other podcasts on the network. Over on the Modern Financial Advisor podcast by Truelytics, Tony Steek, the Chief Operating Officer of Advisant Naviplan, joined me for an expansive conversation about the evolution and future of the financial advisory business and the roles technology will play in getting us there. Tony is absolutely fantastic. And if you're unfamiliar with Naviplan, let this sink in for a second. Over 140,000 financial advisors in North America use it to create and manage financial plans for their clients. So it's kind of a big deal. And if you are interested in scaling your fintech solution, this is a great episode for you to check out. So head on over to the Modern Financial Advisor podcast and get your earbuds on. Also, huge props to the team at Skyview Partners for the recent acquisition of Grand Avenue Capital Partners to add investment banking to their suite of solutions. Nick Arellano, who appeared on the most recent episode of the Advisor Financing Forum podcast with me, will be running the new unit, which makes Skyview Partners a one-stop shop for M&A for RIAs and independent financial advisors. So once again, so thrilled for those guys. Make sure you check out that episode of the podcast and do swing by skyview.com and check out all the new stuff they have to offer for RIAs and independent financial advisors. Send your advisors their way. They're going to love you for it because chances are they may not be aware of all that's available to them from a financing perspective. So really, really cool stuff. Okay, lastly, I have some huge news. Yodelay, yes, that Yodelay is joining the podcast network. We are going to be producing a show for the Yodelay Launchpad ecosystem, which if you're listening to this show, chances are it's right up your alley. So you should definitely check it out and join the community because it's fantastic and you're going to want to be a part of it, right? Because it's all about connecting people in the fintech ecosystem who are looking to build some coolness. So that probably is you if you're listening to this podcast. So stay tuned for the launch of the show. We have recorded the first episode. It's in post-production right now, and we don't exactly have a specific date on when that'll be published, but the episodes are going to start trickling out soon. So do stay tuned for that. I'm so thrilled to have Christine and Holly on, as well as the rest of the Yodelay team. And you're going to be getting a lot of guests from a variety of different areas. We're going to have a lot of international folks on the show. So it's going to be awesome. So stay tuned. Awesome. I've been excited about this. I've wanted to tell you about it, and here it is. It's here. So you're going to love it. All right. let's get to the conversation with Hamid and Rashad from IOWNIT. So, Hamid, Rashad, such an exciting time to be in your space. I'm so excited to have you on the show. So, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So, for those who don't know about I Own It, I thought it would be kind of a fun way to start the show by hearing a bit of I guess it's going to be a tag team elevator pitch from you guys, but how would you describe I Own It to someone who's never heard of the company before?
Yeah, Mike, let me start and then Hamid can add. IOWNIT is a digital private securities marketplace or investment platform. And the way we often talk about it is that, our mission is effectively to provide the investors and the market participants with the convenience of investing in private securities that they've come to expect from the other financial services platforms, whether it's online brokerage, whether it's online banking. So by moving the private securities investments into a completely digital realm, our goal is to give them the convenience and the tools required to make the investments without all of the operational complexity that is associated today with private securities.
And if I can add, Mike, for us at onset, what didn't make really sense was the fact that technology has made such a profound impact on public markets with obviously the high frequency trading, with robo advisory, and even before that with online, execution of trades. And when we compared the public markets with private markets, we realized that the biggest innovation that was, made in the private market was the DocuSign, which we thought that was something that to be addressed.
Very interesting. So, I kicked this thing off by saying that I thought it was a very exciting time for having you on the show, given what I Own It does, because we recently had Henry Yoshida from Rocket Dollar on, and they are all about empowering individual investors to use their retirement plans, like their IRAs or other self-directed tax-deferred plans, to invest in alternative securities. And so that may be investing in private equities, such as a small business or a startup or what have you. And so more and more over the last several years, we are seeing average investors be interested in this, right? Because it's finally been democratized enough. In fact, I think the SEC had a ruling just a couple of days ago that kind of lowered the bar, right, for investing in private securities. Maybe you guys can talk a little more to that if you're aware of it. But to me, it's really, really interesting. But the private security ownership concept is not new. It's been around for generations, but people are now starting to wake up to it and starting to realize that they have access to it. Why is now the right time though for a solution like I Own It? I mean, I guess I kind of tip my hat on that, but like in terms of technology wise and regulation wise, why is 2020 the right timing for you guys?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and you're absolutely right, Mike, that there is more and more interest in private securities or in the regulatory parlance exempt markets. But we actually probably should just take a look at quickly at the history of the private securities versus the public securities and the public markets. And we have to realize that both markets existed in parallel right from the beginning. Just a quick trip down the regulatory space. The securities markets in the US are governed by 33 Act, 34 Act, and all the subsequent modifications, enhancement to those big regulations that were put in place after the Great Depression. And in there, pretty clearly states that if a company or anybody is raising capital by issuing securities, they have to go and register those securities with the SEC, provide the disclosures to the investors, and they're free to tap into the capital markets. And the SEC or those acts, provided some exemptions, and those exemptions evolved over time. But the basic premise was that if you're not raising money from public, if you are restricting yourself to the amount of capital that you raise or the method in which you raise, you don't have to go out there and effectively register your securities with the commission. So the private and the public markets kind of were born almost at the same time. What ended up happening, though, is, as time went by, particularly in the late 1960s and the 70s, the public markets started to grow and effectively separate from the private markets, where the volumes increased, the size of the companies has increased, market capitalization, the diversity of the financial instruments. So probably from about 70s, with the kind of invention and introduction of the central clearing, the public markets just literally took off, right? In this 1970, the volume on New York Stock Exchange was about 15 million shares a day. Today, it's several billion shares per day that get traded. So that market just kind of grew, and by the late 90s, it was actually very, very active, where you had companies remaining in private hands for a very short period of time. Typical age for a company between their first VC round and their IPO was about 3 years. So the public markets were actually functioning pretty well, and the private markets were by and large fairly limited in size and the scope. And unfortunately, what ended up happening is that the dot-com crisis happened, and then there were a number of fraudulent events that happened. Probably we all can remember Enron, WorldCom, and a bunch of other companies. So the regulatory regime around the private markets all of a sudden hardened. With the passage of Sarbanes-Oxley, with the passage of a number of other regulations, it became very, very expensive for companies to go out there into the public markets. The cost of compliance of being in the public markets, increased effectively exponentially. So we can mark that period, right? So the late 90s, early 2000s, as the time when all of a sudden the companies decided that we're not going to go public. We're going to actually change our strategy, our capital strategy, and remain in private hands. And while in the early 2000s, that was still, very nascent, over the space of 20 years, that one decision kind of resulted in a situation where today the private markets are not only very large in size, trillions of dollars of assets in the private markets, but also the types of investments that you discover in the private markets are vastly different and actually diversified in their nature, versus what's available in the public markets. Statistic is, the number of public companies has been cut in half, right? From well over 8,000 companies in the late 90s to just barely over 4,000 today. Whereas if you look in the private markets, it's a much, much larger universe of clients and universe of the companies, etc. So obviously, when you look at that market, right, the size, the opportunity, the diversification that it can offer, the access to a variety of investments, the market has become increasingly important for the investors, and providing a convenient and easy access into that market is becoming basically an imperative for those markets to evolve and grow. So that's why we think that the market today, the private markets have matured and got to the stage where, yes, there needs to be a broader access and more capabilities in there. And you also asked, you kind of mentioned about the SEC, expanding definition of accredited investors. Yes, indeed, that was the, kind of the new rulemaking passed just last week or week before. But that, from our perspective, is just the first step, right? I mean, SEC actually has pretty comprehensive point of view on the exempt markets or the private markets. Last year, they put out a concept release. We actually commented on that, right, in terms of how the exempt markets or private security markets, need to evolve. So we think that is just the early stages, early innings of the evolution of the private markets, and it's quite an exciting time to be part of it.
Awesome. So one of the things that I think is implicit in that the history that you just described there and the evolution of the private markets, right, is as companies are raising a lot more money and staying private longer, one of the byproducts of that is there are more private shareholders, right? Because if you go back a little bit, in history, if it was a private company, usually the ownership of the company was relatively small, right? The number of people who owned parts of the company were the founders and maybe a couple of investors and so forth. But employees weren't getting stock options, right? So they weren't becoming shareholders as employees. So you didn't have, hundreds or in some cases thousands of private shareholders out there, or people who have a contract that says they could become a shareholder at some point in time. So you didn't have that type of ownership interest distributed. That to me leads me to think that's a big part of the reason why a solution like IOWNIT needs to exist. Is that where your mindset was?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So, we talked about the structure of the market, but you're absolutely right. The number of shareholders has increased, or the exposure to the private companies has also increased quite dramatically. And the way, one of the metaphors that I've used, a couple of times in the conversations, I compared the private market to, you know, the growth of a child, right? So, I have children, and every year as they grow, they need new clothes, they need new shoes because they're just simply got bigger. So you got to go shopping and you got to get them stuff that fits them, right, as they grow and develop. What ended up happening with the private market is that, they kind of grew in size, the number of investors, the breadth, the size of the investment, etc. So the market has grown, but frankly, the outfit, right, has not really changed. So the private market or the participants in that compensated a little bit by, adding a duct tape on the sneakers and,
Mhm.
putting, extension on sleeves. And after 20 years, I mean, the patchwork of the technology that is there is pretty complicated, right? So nobody would have done it if they, started from scratch. So yes, indeed, digitizing the private securities and building that infrastructure for a much bigger universe of investors, potentially much broader variety of investment opportunities, and doing it at a reasonable cost with appropriate security is what ION is all about.
Yeah, because I can imagine, if you're working at a company that you joined it as a startup and now it's year 4 into it and you have some ownership, you're starting to sit there and think like liquidity would be nice, right? Like, is this company ever going public, right? And so having a company like IOWNIT provide that potential liquidity is really something that would be exciting to you. What is it that drew the two of you to this space? I mean, obviously, we're talking about it as an exciting frontier, something that continues to evolve and expand. So naturally, that sounds like attractive. But you know, you're two smart guys, and you've been in the financial services ecosystem for the majority of your careers. But you were working for the big boys, right? The J.P. Morgans, the Merrills, the UBSs. And very often that doesn't translate. If you're working for Big Co, you don't always see somebody leave the safe confines of these large companies and go off and start a fintech startup. So, what was the aha moment in which you looked at each other and said, "You know what? I think we're onto something. Let's do this. Let's leave Big Co and go do some really cool stuff over here."
Well, let me try to address that. So I think I can speak for myself. Is that obviously, one thing was that prior to starting IONIT, I ran a boutique investment bank where we were focused on private placements. And at some point, I realized that most of my services as a senior banker was essentially the key of the key role that I had was introduction of capital. And at that point, I think it was like late 2016, I noticed, obviously, the Bitcoin, the rise in the price of Bitcoin, and a number of ICOs were coming up. And I thought, like, well, okay, I need to kind of read up and understand what the technology is and what are the implications, because it seemed like, well, it was a lot more efficient process in terms of raising capital. I mean, you saw that, some of the funding done within like a few weeks versus like us, like going in a traditional way would take, months, maybe 5 to 6 months. So I phoned up Rashad because I knew Rashad was in technology, well versed in technology. And I started talking about it. So like, well, what do you think? And let's look at this, blockchain technology and whether it can be implemented for the benefit of capital seekers, and help the investors to kind of democratize the investment process and facilitate the capital formation in a much more efficient way that exists today. And then we started talking, and then one thing led to another.
Absolutely. I mean, that's kind of how we, started this. And I came to IOWNIT from a slightly different perspective. I spent 20 years before that on the trading floor or working in technology across most of the major investment banks. And honestly, during that period of time, it was basically a relentless march of technology, from replacing paper tickets with electronic order capture, from, even replacing the trading algorithms, etc. So to me, it was inevitable that technology is going to come in and enter this very large market. And combining these skills and the knowledge that we had made it natural, just kind of led us to believe that we can make an impact, right? So it's not just, hey, let's simplify our own lives, but frankly, also how we can bring the benefits of the technology to a much larger audience, whether it's investors, whether it's issuers, capital seekers, whether it's their advisors, etc. So that was for us the aha moment, which is we know how to do it. The technology is there and we can develop it. The market is ready. The time is right. So let's just jump in and kind of make a mark, on the market.
So was this your first startup endeavor, or had you guys launched businesses either together or individually before?
So for me, I have, like I said, after working with JP Morgan, we left with a group of bankers from JP Morgan after the financial crisis, not immediately, but a little bit later, once the market stabilized, and we set up our own investment banking boutique and kind of ran it in a successful way over the course of 5-6 years. We were able to raise north of $12 billion of capital for our clients. But throughout the process, I felt that things could be done better. So for me, this is a second venture.
Yeah, and on my side, it's the first tech-driven startup. I work for smaller consulting firms where, the atmosphere is not that different to a startup, but was never kind of the owner or the founder, right? So to me, this is the first rodeo.
Nice. Very cool. Well, let's talk a little bit about the background that brought you to this. I mean, we just talked about the aha moment, but Joseph, who is quiet in the background there on mute. I see him. He's there with us, probably nodding along, but he suggested that, we talk a little bit about your background because it is fairly unique. And I like this concept of talking a little bit about like what brought people to where they are in terms of creating things, because there's a lot of insights you can get there. And I think a lot of us can learn from the startup journey, right? The career journey, kind of the life journey that people go through, because it is different for everyone, but sometimes you can pick out some common learnings along the way. So I guess you're both first generation immigrants. You met when you were younger, and kind of as Joseph said, a little bit of yada, yada, yada. The world brought you back together again for IOWNIT. So I know I kind of simplified it, but I'm going to get you to tell the story. How is it after all the years, you're kind of younger, that you kind of came back together? Like what were the things that kept on bringing you back and so forth? And maybe kind of start with your early interest in the financial markets, maybe.
Both of us kind of had a same start, slightly different journey, and then we kind of got back together on IOWNIT. Both Hamid and myself are from Azerbaijan. I came to the States in 1990. Literally right after the Soviet Union collapsed. Azerbaijan was part of the Soviet Union. Right after the Soviet Union collapsed, and I was one of the first students that were sent to study in the US. And to me, frankly, coming to the US at the time was probably the most exciting thing that could have happened to, any kid of my generation in Azerbaijan or Eastern Europe, whatever, because the US was the land of opportunity and the freedom and entrepreneurship, innovation, the success, etc. Going to college here, obviously learned all of that, and then went to work in the financial services industry. That was becoming more and more important part of of the overall economy, right? So the economy was changing, and I was kind of in, as part of that. And I think if I, kind of reflect back on that, right? So personally, I came to the U.S. I mean, this was all about pursuing the opportunity. When we started thinking about IOWNIT, and I'll let Hamid to kind of add his perspective. But when I started thinking about IOWNIT and the technology and the capital flow and the formation, the word opportunity and the access was actually pretty prominent in the thinking, right? To build an innovative company, or to grow it or achieve things, capital is a pretty important one. So in some ways, to me, it's also about, creating the opportunities for investors and entrepreneurs and the capital seekers to achieve their goals, right? So that focus on enablement was actually a pretty important one that I think stayed consistent with me throughout the entire career. Hamid, I don't know if you want to kind of give your perspectives on this.
Right. I mean, for me, and I love personally history, and I since my early days when I was a teenager, at that time, I don't know, Mike, if you remember, there was a popular TV series, 90210.
Oh yeah, I remember.
And,
Yep.
yeah, well, for those of us who are old enough to remember that. So I fell in love with this, with America, this American dream, and and it was obvious to me that one of the, probably the most important reason why the American values and the freedom that it was able, the message of that freedom that was, spreading around the world was the fact that America had such a strong economy and such a vibrant, financial markets. So to me, I mean, it was just a natural choice kind of to study economics and finance. And obviously a dream would be to work on Wall Street. So I remember it was a very difficult journey. Getting a job, on Wall Street was not, very easy. But so it was great when I landed one. And from then on, yes, it was just about, expanding and learning, constantly learning about the ways the markets function and then how this markets can be improved.
I love it. So were you watching 90210 in Azerbaijan, or was that when you first came to the States? Were you able to get that type of TV back there?
Right. I mean, yes, we were. The Soviet Union just, collapsed, and it was a big, kind of movement, I think, in Azerbaijan, in terms of, like, well, let's explore, right? I mean, we were kind of sealed, or like nobody was able to travel before, and there was huge interest, pent up interest and demand for everything U.S. Culture wise and music wise and product wise. So yeah.
Interesting. So it's interesting. You both kind of hit on this a little bit. I wonder if we can kind of, I don't know, chat on it a bit more. Is that your background coming from a former Soviet bloc, communist country, and your youth and seeing things change there, and then coming to a new country, it sounds like it's opened your eyes, or your eyes were opened early. Like, wow, look at all this opportunity. Both of you kind of mentioned opportunity and the possibilities available to you. But how do you think that being born in a communist country kind of shaped your thoughts? Because obviously, your parents and your family and those surroundings were different. Did it shape you a little bit differently? Do you think it kind of made you hungrier, maybe, or is there some other ways, and you see it like in your life even now?
Let me start, Rashad, and then you can contribute. But from my perspective, I think we don't take this liberties for granted, and I think that's one of the important one for me, because obviously, we've seen in our early childhood how things can be different, and they can. So that's one, and out of that hunger that you're referring to, it kind of pushes you to kind of contribute and kind of develop and learn and evolve essentially as a member of the community. So that's, I think, would be my response to this. So yes, I mean, don't take things for granted. You got to be hungry. You got to evolve, constantly learn.
Yeah, and I mean, I would agree with Hamid. The additional thing for me was, I mean, look, the communist or former communist countries, they all existed on here's a set of rules, and you can do this, you cannot do that. Somebody's going to dictate, how the society or the country or the economy is going to develop. We all saw how that ended, right? So part of what is important for me is that there is really no prescribed way of doing things. Everything is constantly evolving and changing, and only when and if you take the risk and you try to actually make the change, create the opportunities, you can be successful. So don't sit and wait for somebody to, effectively hand something to you on a silver platter because somebody made a plan somewhere, right? Go out there, roll up your sleeves, do the job, and you'll be rewarded. That to me is, I think it's ingrained in everybody of our generation that came from that part of the world. I mean, it's pretty consistent.
Yeah. I like it. I mean, I'm really glad we dove into that because it is a really good reminder to myself too. I think all of us need that reminder occasionally, like kind of stop your whining, look at all the opportunity you have because you're gonna have those bad days or those challenges that you're going through where you're like, ugh, it's just so frustrating. And then you stop and go, yeah, it's not all that big of a deal. I can do this. And I also think that a lot of times people they over dramatize in their mind, right? The potential failure. So they don't try things sometimes, right? So they don't innovate because they're afraid, what if I fail? And it's like, well, what if you fail? You'll do something else, right? That type of thing. Do you have in this country specifically, as you've mentioned a few times, like there's endless opportunity. There's lots of innovation. And by the way, access to capital is really not as big of a problem as people think it is. There's lots of people with money out there. I always joke around like, if you ever see a really crappy movie, like just a terrible movie, you're like, you do realize somebody backed that movie. Like somebody heard the pitch for that movie and said, yeah, I'm in. Here's some millions. Go make it.
Right.
um, what are some of the kind of thinking about challenges because again, everybody goes through them, and particularly entrepreneurs in a startup. There's lots of challenges that are going to come your way, right? Uh, what are some of the ones that you guys have faced, and how have you overcome them? And are any of those things like things you didn't see coming, maybe curveballs?
Mhm. Um,
I'll
it's
start and
Yeah. Go ahead,
perfect.
Amit.
And then, so I think the initial challenge for us was explain what we are setting out to do, frankly. And I can speak from my personal experiences when I try to explain to my former colleagues, big financial institutions, in terms of how this can be done differently in terms of like private capital formation. I'm often faced kind of blank stares in the sense that, well, look, there's a reason why things are done this way. And why do you think that you can come up with a better way if things have been like this for like really, really, a long time? So for me, the biggest challenge was to get our initial, capital in, and to get there, obviously, we needed to convey the story and find those who would be, who would buy into it, and that was not an easy feat to pull.
Yeah, and just to kind of that's the initial challenge, right? But I think also I'll add a few more things. Um, Running a company, building a business, we face challenges every single day, right? So the challenge is basically tackling challenges and dealing with them is the name of the game, right? There is no day without a challenge. And for me, having gone through the first phase and yeah, okay, we got it. Now the challenges are how do we convince the clients? How do we get clients on board? How do we recruit and retain staff? How do we build partnerships, etc.? All of those are, basically part of the fabric of entrepreneurship, right?
Mm.
This is what you're supposed to do, and when you start, that's what you sign up to do. So anybody who's kind of considering getting and starting their own business, needs to be prepared to take that on and not look at them as the roadblocks, but as just another opportunity to improve the product, improve the company, improve the value proposition, improve our market positioning. So, while every day we are facing challenges, I actually think of them as, it's the road, right? You just got to keep walking it, because if you don't, then really the reward that is at the end is not yours. You're not going to get to it.
I like that mentality, right? It is like, look, if you're going to do anything in life, it's very rarely going to be, okay, I want to do this, and it just goes smoothly, right? There are going to be things you didn't think about. There are going to be extraneous circumstances and happenings that try to get in your way, right? Like, could be a competitor, could be a regulator, could be and investors not understanding it, as you mentioned earlier on. Like, sometimes people just don't get it, even though you think it's really easy and obvious. Sometimes people just don't get it initially, and it takes a little while. I mean, the easiest thing to think of is, you know, go back 10 years or so, maybe even 12 years, but 10 years feels about right. And, think about explaining why, somebody should be on Facebook or be sharing photos on Instagram. The people looked at you like, why would I want to do that? Sometimes I remember I'm a very early user of LinkedIn. I'm like user number 179,000 on LinkedIn out of their 500,000,000 users, right? I remember having to invite people to use LinkedIn and try to convince them why it would be really good for them to basically put their resume on the cloud and connect with other people. And they're like, well, why do I want to put my information on the internet? I don't want people knowing all my information. Like, yes, you do. You want to connect with people. And so it took a little while for people to kind of get that concept. So hurdles are all around us. And you just, like you said, you just have to like look at them, see how you get around them, over them, through them, whatever it is, right? You mentioned hiring, staffing up, building your team as one of those, challenges that every business and entrepreneur has to face. One thing that's really interesting to me, I went through the team on the website, and I noticed, like, even before COVID-19, you guys built a remote team, right? You have folks in Houston, New York, Austin, Portugal, like, seems like all over the place. How has operating a remote distributed team helped you grow? Because to me, I love the concept that you're like, we're not just going to be pigeonholed to like hiring people from our own neighborhood. How did that come about that you have this remote team this early in the business?
So part of it is by design, part of it is by accident.
Okay.
When we started, actually, IOWNIT, even Hamid and I were in geographically different locations. So right from the start, we were, separated by distance, communicated by phone, video, etc. Our first hire was our CTO, and the philosophy that we took, the approach that we took, was basically we're gonna find and hire the best talent wherever we can find them, because otherwise you are really limited to the locations where you can be, the cost that you have to bear, and the competition for the talent that you have to endure. So our CTO, Victor, he was based in Lisbon, and for us, he brought the right skill set, etc. So for us, it was like, look, we're going to make it work. And from there, we ended up building the team in Lisbon, adding the team in Kiev, in Ukraine, where there are a lot of very talented software developers that were actually happy to work for the U.S. company. So the approach that we took was that let geography not dictate to us where we'll go to look for the talent. Let's go out there and find the best people that can help us to get our mission, vision, completed, executed, etc. It's not easy, right? So I will kind of admit that, right? And as we kind of growing now our business team, so we have somebody in Austin, we have some folks associated with us in Silicon Valley, Chicago, Denver. It's not easy, right? Because one thing is everybody congregates in the office. There's the osmosis, information flow, etc. So the goal for us, has been, okay, how do we bring the technology to replicate that, right? Replicate the flow of information, build a common culture. For example, we're all are very avid users of Zoom, Slack, communication tools that are there. And frankly, once you get used to it, you realize that it actually works, right? So you're not really missing a hell of a lot from not everybody being in the same location. So for us, it's been, quite successful and effective. So frankly, when, COVID, shut down, large parts of the economy, we did not skip a bit. I mean, it's just like pack up your laptop, go home, work from home until, we tell you otherwise. And so far, we haven't told anybody otherwise. We're continuing to work remote.
And if I can add to this, and it's probably will be interesting to our listeners, is that the American culture continues to be very appealing internationally. So even if you have a multinational team located in different parts of the world, you find that in terms of cultural kind of differences, although people obviously have accents and so forth, but culturally it's not much. It's not very difficult because people understand what you're referring to and what are the goals and objectives. It's not like completely like different worlds. So in that sense, I think it's also added to kind of the ease of our operations.
I like that you pointed that out because I think there are some people who are a little uncomfortable. Well, frankly, with people in different time zones, right? Because it poses a challenge, right? It's not an insurmountable challenge, but dealing with somebody who might be located in a different part of the country or the world. But I love that you mentioned that. Look, culturally, people are a lot more similar than you realize, right? I mean, internationally, a lot of times they're watching the same TV shows, as you mentioned, 90210. They're watching similar movies. It may be they may do some dubbing or whatever with the languages and so forth, but people are a lot more alike than you think, and there is attractiveness to American culture, but also the American market of working in this space. So don't pigeonhole yourself to just working here in the States. In fact, Truelytics, client of ours, their CTO, he and his family are in Barcelona, right? They're Americans, but they've decided to go live in Barcelona, and they've been living there for years and enjoying a great life. And it doesn't affect the business at all. In fact, since bringing Eli on as the CTO, the company has grown and accelerated the pace of innovation and delivering out their products. So it actually can have a lot of benefits, right? Working with somebody who is in another part of the world. Really interesting.
Yep.
So as we get close to kind of closing this out, my favorite question is here for you guys, and I really do love this question. And for the audience, Hamid and Rashad were supposed to, if COVID had not happened, come to Austin and present IOWNIT to the SoFin at South by Southwest audience, right? So we get a big audience, usually it's 300 people packed in an outdoor venue, kind of semi-outdoor, whatever, sharing different startup stories, right? And then one of the things I always do is ask everybody who gets up on the stage to have an ask of the audience, right? You're rolling up, don't just demo your startup and talk about the cool stuff you're building, but ask the audience to do something for you, or ask them to send you something, or give you an opinion, or whatever that is, because we're here for a reason, right? And I ask everybody who's in the audience to do the same thing. If you have an ask of somebody at the community, make sure you send that in, because we all want to help each other grow. So if an audience member is listening and they could do something for you, what would you ask of them?
That's an interesting question. I mean, to me, probably the most important one would be give me feedback. We are pretty experienced in capital markets. We know the technology pretty well, but nobody has ever, to my knowledge, has developed a 100% perfect product for any market, right? There's always an evolution. And in every conversation that we're having, we always say, look, we've done this. If I got something wrong, tell me. If you want to see something else, tell me. We're not going to promise you that we'll drop everything and we'll do it for you, but at least I want to hear your feedback. The worst thing that you can have as an entrepreneur is that if you go somewhere, you present, you talk, you demo, and there's silence, and people just walk away, right? They might be happy, they might be unhappy, they might like it, they might not like it, but you just don't know. So if we were to, kind of present in front of a larger audience, my last slide would be, here are my contact information. Just get in touch and let us know what you think, right? Be passionate. You can be passionate pro, you can be passionate against. I don't like, both are fine. Just don't be indifferent.
I love that. How about you, Hamid? Is there something as you're thinking about this that you'd want from somebody listening to do for you?
No, I mean, I honestly don't have anything to add. It was such a all-encompassing, answer that yeah, I don't have. Yes, that's exactly what we would love everyone to do: kind of learn and comment.
Well, and it's funny. I'm glad you brought that one up of like asking for feedback, Rashad, because the reality is too often people who are building companies, you get a tunnel vision, right? You're in it, you're building it, you're doing it every day, and sometimes it's really hard for you to see it for what it is, and that could be positive and negative, right? So on the negative side, it could be you've missed something, right? You're not connected with the user or the customer, and you're building something that you don't even know if they actually want. But on the positive side, there may be other use cases of what you're building or other opportunities that a customer is just sitting there be willing to tell you, or they're sitting there, hey, if you did this, it would really help me and it would be really valuable to me. And history is replete with stories like that of entrepreneurs starting something and all of a sudden a customer starts using it a little bit differently and asking for a feature. And that opens up a whole other branch that they had not thought of. So I love that feedback. So if you have feedback for IOWNIT, make sure you give it to the gents. Well, gentlemen, and Yosef quietly in the background, I really appreciate you carving the time out of your day to spend it with us in the audience here, and the audience here, because I learned a ton. I'm really excited about what you're building, and I can't wait to see where you go next.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike. Pleasure. Pleasure to be.
By the way, people are going to want to follow up with you guys. What's the best way for people to get in touch with you? It looks like you're both active on LinkedIn. Is there any other special ways that you'd like people to reach out to give you that feedback?
I mean, folks, anybody can always visit us at IOWNIT.us, which is our website. There contact us information, and we typically respond very promptly. So rather than trying to spell out my last name and email, just visit us at IOWNIT.us. You'll get more detail about us as a company, and you can contact us from there, and we'll be glad to hear from anybody.
Perfect. All right. And I'll make sure I link that up in the show notes and link up your LinkedIn profiles as well so that somebody can reach out to you if they want to. So once again, thank you, gentlemen. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the SoFin Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please give it a like and make sure you share it with a friend or a colleague, right? They're probably interested in all the coolness that we're talking about here. Help us spread the word. And of course, we want to grow the community here as well. Also, if you have a question or suggestion for a topic or a guest, please reach out. You can reach me at mike@finservmarketing.com, or I'm basically at Mike Langford everywhere on social. So I'm not hard to find. Reach on out. Go to the finservmarketing.com website. Use the contact form there as well. Whatever floats your boat. Just get in touch. Let me know about a topic you want to see us cover. If you want to be a guest on the show and you're relevant, awesome. If you know somebody who should be on the show, send them our way. That would be fantastic. And of course, huge thanks to Hamid and Rashad for joining us today. I really loved their stories, and I really dig what they're building at IOWNIT as well. But their stories really just captivated me. Awesome stuff. I have a feeling they're going to do some great things here with IOWNIT and beyond. So stay in touch with those dudes. And lastly, big ups to my man, Yosef Levenstein, because he's the head of marketing there at IOWNIT, and he's the one who coordinated everything. He reached out, like I encourage everybody to do, and said, hey, Mike, I think the founders of IOWNIT would be fantastic for the show. And I said, I think you're right, Yosef. So let's do this thing. And there we go. Awesome stuff. All right. As always, make sure you are wearing your mask, keeping your distance, and staying safe, please. We want to make sure you make it to the next episode of the show. And then lastly, be nice to each other. You know how I feel about that, okay? We'll see you next time on the SoFin Podcast. See ya. Bye.